Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session in the series of software project management. I'm very happy to join this conversation on prioritization, especially given the amount of hours we spend just thinking about priorities collectively as a group. So, today's speaker is actually joining us all the way from San Francisco. So, I'm really, really thankful for Gaurav for you to kind of like uh, join from all the way. I know, like we're joining remotely, but it feels like that. I would love to welcome Gaurav, who has like 2 decades of experience in the business, ranging from corporates to startups to even at some point owning his own company. And he's currently the head of engineering at PhonePe. And I believe as a group, all of us can learn a lot from him, not just about tech. And I don't think that I can capture his journey as well as he could in his own words. So, Gaurav, please do share a little bit about yourself and anything that I would have missed for the
Cool.
group.
No, yeah, thanks, Sanchita. Thanks for doing this. And it's a topic that I'm pretty excited about. So I've worked for a while now. And like you said, I've worked at small companies. I started at Microsoft and then joined a 10% startup. We were doing cloud computing, didn't know that the term didn't exist. This is 2005. VMware bought that company, continued on at VMware, moved to India, did my own startup. Um, Worked at Flipkart on the ebooks and MP3 apps, and that's where I got some really good mobile exposure. And then left Flipkart to join a really small startup again, which was building Android performance tooling. And that company got bought by Facebook. So kind of went through that acquisition again, moved back to the US, and then stayed on at Facebook for about 8 years. And a lot of what I'm talking about today is just blatantly stolen from what I've learned at Facebook. Facebook is definitely a very use data, prioritize for impact, prioritize ruthlessly kind of company. And I learned some amazing stuff over there. So I'm really just talking about what I learned there. And then I got to apply it in other jobs because after that I went to what so I worked on main Facebook for 5 years, and then I worked at WhatsApp for 3 years. And I actually got to apply some of this at WhatsApp. And then I joined PhonePe about a year and a half ago, and I'm managing the PhonePe mobile platform team. And I'm still getting to apply some of this stuff here. So that's a brief about my journey. I would say the last 6 years has been more mobile platform versus product. I did some interesting product work at Facebook in the growth team. We were trying to grow Facebook for India, so that was like a really interesting experience. And Flipkart was clearly like ebooks and MP3 apps was very, very productish. So some of the examples we'll cover today may be a little bit more platform and infra versus product, but everything I'm talking about applies in both spheres. So so yeah, with that, like I'm excited to be here, and we can probably jump right in.
Yes. All right. So let's begin, shall we? Uh, I think thank you for sharing, of course, like what you have worked on so far. And I think I'm really excited to dive deeper into your experience at Facebook. So I think before we get into the details of those examples and those experiences, I think it will be really helpful if we can define a little bit of what prioritization for impact actually means. I think prioritization in general is something that a lot of people are aware of, but I think what role does impact have to play in that? If you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think everyone inherently wants to deliver impact. And so I think what I'm going to talk about today is how do you kind of make that more of a process or more thoughtful, right? So, and the reason I think it's important is, first of all, every startup and actually most companies today don't have enough bandwidth to do all the things they want to do. There's probably 20 things any team wants to do, and at any point of time, you can only do 4 or 5 of those things. So you do have to prioritize and pick those things. And I think what I'm going to stress on is that sometimes this process is a little bit more ad hoc. It's like people come up with some ideas. People sometimes go with what they think makes sense and not necessarily doing enough diligence or using enough data. And So I think what I'm going to talk about today is really how do you pull data for that process? How do you spend some time on that process? And what are some questions that you ask so that you're clear about what the impact of this project is going to be? And I mean, I think it's actually really good. Like in this project management series, I think this is a good time to do this because this is the starting point. If you have a good sense of why you're building something, then there's a lot of other things in terms of how you build it and how you plan. But I think the why is really important, and sometimes it doesn't get enough time.
Right. I mean, I think I really like the fact that you're talking about how can you keep your feelings and emotions kind of like separated and the subjectivity separated
Yeah.
when you are doing prioritization. It sounds like a very engineering driven approach to prioritization, and I'm really excited about getting into more details with it. So I think that now that we've established the topic, uh, I think it seems like that this sounds like something that would actually uh, the impact part which you're talking about, it seems like that you said that impact is something people do think about, right, most of the times. So what exactly do you think as a piece is missing, which you are
Yeah.
actually you are trying to bring focus to?
Yeah. I think when you start the project, just try to articulate what is the impact going to be. And it has to be a little bit better than, it definitely has to be better than, I think we should do this because, like it has to be a little bit more like, for example, let's say you want to reduce app size. We generally know that app size reduction is good, but that's not enough, right? That's not enough of a statement. So, for example, I mean, Google actually published that if you reduce 6 MB, you increase your churn rate by, or you decrease your churn rate by 1%. So if someone has a project where they kind of say, we have found ways to reduce 12 MB, and based on Google's analysis, we think that this could help decrease churn by 2%. That to me is a much better articulation than reducing app size is good for the world, right? Um, and in some cases, I mean, this one, Google's published some data. If your company has already seen this play out in the past, that's even better. Then you have your own internal data because, I mean, Google data is generic. But at least here's an example of explaining the why as opposed to a more broad, like broad statement. Um, Sometimes you need to run A/B tests even in the beginning to get some signal. Sometimes you can pull existing data. And I think that in many cases, people, when they start thinking about this impact part, they'll realize they don't have the data. And that's when you kind of stop and say, okay, we thought this is a great idea. Um, like I'll give you an example. Like at PhonePe, we wanted to add memory leak detection, and it's again, it's not a bad thing to do, right? But we didn't have a clear picture of what is the impact of doing that project. If we're spending 3 months, is it worth it? And then the engineer basically, so at that point, if he had said, "I'm going to go do this because I think it's a good idea," that's not good enough. But then he spent some time, looked at our Git repository, looked at the number of memory leaks that we had fixed in the last 6 months, and projected that, look, we've already fixed 20 leaks in 6 months. If we built tooling, then we will at least catch these sooner. And 20 is the lower bound. 20 is what we found and fixed. So his tooling would have got more. So that's where sometimes you have to stop and spend extra time on collecting data.
Right, right. And I think this reminds me of like when I first met you, one of the reasons we met you was because of your experience at WhatsApp. I think back then you were at WhatsApp, and we were working on this app called Simple. And I remember we were also an offline first app, and we remember that WhatsApp had like a whole bunch of like local data that they would store. So we wanted to get your thoughts on like how do you tackle like apps slowing down or just generally having like too many database queries locally. And I think one of the first things that you told us was, where's the data? Like, show me something, which tells you that database queries are the ones which are responsible for this. Because we were finding it really hard to, kind of like squash everything in one go. And I think eventually this process of collecting data and then figuring out what is the top two things that we need to tackle first, which will have the maximum amount of impact. I think that process really, really helped us in the longer run. And to be honest, it saved us a whole bunch of time in the end. So I think that was really, really helpful. But I think this also kind of brings me to a point where I want to ask and just be curious about the fact that this sounds like something which is a time taking process in general.
Yeah.
And especially like if you're doing it this at the prioritization stage, where your sprints are not started and you're not really sure if this task will even like land the way you wanted to. So like, what are your thoughts on that? Like the amount of time we end up spending in this activity?
Yeah. And that's a really good question, because I think that's often the reason why people don't do it. They feel like, okay, it's going to take a lot of time. And I would say be pragmatic. So like if it's going to take you a week to actually build this thing, and if it's going to take you a week to collect the data, then don't spend a week collecting the data. I would say, and again, I'm really pulling a rough number out, but if 20% of the overall engineering effort is what it takes to collect good data, I would spend that time. For a week of engineering effort, it's okay to spend a day. For a 3-month project, it's okay to spend a week. And the reason, and sometimes people are like, oh, but that's a lot of time, right? We're wasting 20%. So you can think of it as an overhead. I think of it as an 80% discount. Because if you don't do this and you're wrong, you've just wasted 3 months on a failed or unsuccessful project. And this way, at least you are more likely to, get success out of it. So that's my pragmatic rule of thumb.
Got it. And like, what do you do when data is something which is not available, like right off the bat?
Yeah.
Like, is there a mechanism there?
Yeah, so I think there's always some kind of data you can use. And by data, it doesn't always mean absolute clear metric data. I mean, it could be directional data. So like you can add some logs that give you a sense of, let's say you're hypothesizing about some feature and you want to change something there. At least have some logs on how many people are using that today, right? And in some cases, you can even calculate upper bound. So like, let's say you want to optimize build size. You can say the build, not build size, build time. Build takes 10 minutes. There is an optimization, and you're not completely sure whether how much that will shave off. But you know that in that 10-minute build, that step is let's say 3-minute step. So your upper bound of fixing it is 3 minutes. Now, whether that 3 minutes becomes 1 minute or 30 seconds or 2 minutes, you don't know that yet. But you know that you're saving at most 30% of this 10 minutes. So that's having upper bounds at least helps in the conversation. Right? So, and I'll give an example, like an interesting example at Facebook. By the way, I mean, I worked at Facebook a long time ago. I feel like I'm past the statute of limitations to talk about some stuff.
No, absolutely.
I don't have all of the data in my head, but I think directionally what I'm going to talk about is fine. So I worked in the growth team, and we were trying to grow Facebook in India. And we knew that people in India were not engaging with Facebook content as much as in other countries. And obviously, content engagement is why people, used to come to Facebook. So we also had some interesting insights that in India, engagement on local script content was almost 5x of engagement on English content. And that kind of makes sense, right? If someone has a Hindi post, right, that's going to get more engagement. And we also had data that local language content was a fraction of English content. So in India back then, I think local language was less than 5%. So these were two insights on what the potential impact would be. And then one other third insight was that I tried to install a Hindi keyboard. I was an Android engineer. It took me 30 minutes to figure out how to install it. And this is, again, 2015. There was no Gboard supporting Hindi. So we realized that there is a genuine problem here. And so we just said, this is our proxy data. We came up with a simple solution of what if we built in transliteration inside the app? You don't have to install a keyboard. You click one button and it just starts showing you Hindi suggestions. And very simple idea. It didn't take a lot of engineering. There was 2 months of an intern project and then probably 4 months between me and another engineer. And with this directional data, we knew that there's potential impact. We didn't know how much impact our solution would have because no one really knows. But we did this, and we saw an increase in content production. We saw an increase in engagement for people in this with this feature. And we most interestingly, we saw an MAU increase, a statistically significant MAU increase from this, which is very rare, like for a single feature to do that. So it kind of gave us an insight that, it validated that we were on the right path.
Right.
So,
So if I have to like dig deeper into that particular experience, what role? So how did this mindset of prioritization kind of help you achieve that? Like, if you want to reiterate just that part.
yeah. Um, yeah, the project was actually done in iterations. And the main mindset of prioritization was like, should we keep investing? Right. So the intern spent 2 months, built a basic working solution. Then we had to decide, is it worth investing more? And having this data gave us confidence that it is worth investing more. Now, supposing after the first prototype, we realize it's going to take us 18 months to build. I think at that point, we probably would have paused and said, we need better data. But when we said, it's 4 months between two of us, it seemed like it seemed like we had good enough signals to spend those 4 months. So that's the prioritization. And I could have worked, the other engineer and I could have worked on different projects. So this data helped us pick this project over other things.
So if I understand correctly, what you're trying to say here also is the fact that this idea of building an iteration, which I think a lot of us do understand, uh, it kind of this idea of prioritization for impact kind of brings you back to this idea of building through iteration, right?
Yeah.
Like where you have something which is larger, but it's harder to like put resources into that, or maybe like you don't have that much time, or maybe it's harder to convince people to even like pick up a project like that in the first place. I think that might be true
Yeah.
for a lot of people. So in all of those scenarios, if you are able to say that, okay, can you give me at least like a month to do this, like a 20% time to do this,
Yeah.
and then we can decide whether we want to do the 80% or not. This itself kind of gives you enough to go on and sell on that idea. Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we have spoken a little bit about what worked, and I think this might be a good time for me to put you on the spot and also talk about projects where this did not work and it actually failed for some reason.
So I guess I was going to say unfortunately, but maybe it's fortunate. I've been on a lot of projects that have also failed. And it is fortunate because I think that's where you learn interesting lessons. And I know it's cliched, people keep saying that, but I really believe in that. So actually a follow-up project for the keyboard is, this first version was shipped in early 2016 and it did well, but it was really built quickly. And then in mid of 2017, we decided to bring that project back. And this was the keyboard V2 project. And now we had enough usage data and we had some bandwidth and we said, okay, let's build this project. Let's build more on this. Let's improve the UI. Let's improve the ML model. Let's add more languages. Let's add a couple more features like predictive word prediction. So we had all these cool ideas on what would make the keyboard better. And I think you can kind of see where this is going. I think another problem was that we also had a lot of engineers and it's interesting. I won't really go into the details, but we kind of had people volunteering to work on this. Um, so we actually had a lot of engineering resources to do this, but it was not in a well-planned way. So I think the mistake I made is that we didn't put measurement systems up front. We just said, here are these cool ideas. We think if we build all of this stuff, the keyboard will be much better than it is today. And we just have to build all of this stuff. And once we build all of this stuff, people will love it. And we just started building this stuff. And it took us about 3 months. And we shipped a bunch of things. And at the end of 3 months, we weren't seeing enough positive impact. We didn't see enough movement in terms of content production or engagement. And it became really hard to understand what worked and what didn't work. the overall AB results were diluted because earlier the experiment was limited to Hindi speaking regions. And actually, we started targeting specific cities. Now we were looking across India because we added all or a bunch of languages, 10 languages. We think we degraded the performance. We swapped out the system keyboard. So we did a lot of things. And honestly, we couldn't explain what worked and what didn't work. Some things should have worked, but we just didn't have good measurement. And so after 3 months in a checkpoint, we realized we're not seeing enough impact. Then we started scrambling for 2 months, trying to like figure out what worked, backtest certain things, add logging. And unfortunately, at roughly a 5-month checkpoint, we still didn't have enough data to convince folks that it's worth doing. And then this project got paused. And I believe there was much more to be like, I believe this project could have succeeded. There was definitely value for people in India to be able to easily produce content in their own language. We just didn't have a clear set of data to prove that. And we'd invested 5 months across multiple engineers. So,
Yeah, I think the serve failure definitely sounds very familiar, to be honest.
yeah.
I think going down a rabbit hole without having that kind of clarity, and then you undergo this whole sunken cost phase where you're like, oh, now we've invested
Yeah.
so much time, so we might as well spend another month. And you are looking at like that 5 months, 6 months turning into an year before you know it. And I think I think this example is something has like a whole bunch of stuff which I feel I could go slightly deeper into. So I think you spoke about the fact that in the beginning itself there were too many people who were trying to get into the project. Do you think that idea of saying that, okay, this looked like a cool fancy thing that everybody wanted to contribute into, and this shiny new thing, and I think all of us kind of get mesmerized by stuff like that once in a while, especially
Yeah.
engineers. I think as an engineer, I think I have done that a whole bunch of times. So do you think that kind of like rooting yourself in data and rooting yourself in saying that if I can measure and if I can say that what I believe to be true is actually true through data, and the sooner I'm able to do it, the faster I'll be able to get on with it. Do you think that's what that was like in my, as I was listening to it, felt like that was one of the takeaways for me?
Yeah. No, I think it absolutely would have made a difference. In fact, one of the senior engineers on the project, Ajay, was actually pushing me on this in the beginning. And I wish I'd heard him through. And he was like, let's start collecting data for this. And I felt like this is all going to work. We know it's going to work, right? So if we actually had started collecting data, I think the project would still have been shiny. Some of the steps wouldn't have worked, but those steps or those iterations would have pointed us in the right direction. And I think that's really what I think what went wrong. It's almost like you want to get from point A to point B, right? But your GPS is not telling you intermediate steps. It's just kind of saying, here's your starting point, here's your end point, and it's giving you some very, very high level pointers, and you may end up in the wrong place. So I think having measurement in place would really have shifted this project.
This is where directional data comes into picture, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, I think I don't want to get deeper into that project anymore. I think now would be a good point for us to talk about when was the first time you realized the real power of, using something like this that you learned at Facebook, which is prioritization for impact and having that kind of mindset. I think I would also want to bring up the fact that one of the things that you and I, when we were talking about this topic, you spoke about culture and how culture and mindset plays a huge role in being able to do that impact analysis. So maybe if you can share that example and share like how we were able to bring that mindset into either your work or your teams.
Yeah. Okay, so let me first give you an example, and then maybe we'll come back to the culture and how to introduce that into a team. So actually, the first project where I think I did this well was right after that keyboard V2. And now this was also at Facebook. We were trying to look at actually, we knew that the disk space used by the app, like it used a lot of space. And in some cases, people were probably uninstalling or leaving Facebook because it was too, I guess, too greedy. And what was helpful is that we had one fix in the prior year, like in 2017, someone made a fix where they reduced the size of some cache and the on disk. So the disk space here is once you've installed the app, as you're using the app, it's using space on your phone. It's not the app size, the APK size. It's the databases, and it downloads things and it keeps things in a set of folders. And you can't delete those folders. As a user, you don't have access to them. The only thing you can do is uninstall the app, or clear data, which is effectively like uninstalling and reinstalling. So we knew that a video cache fix had reduced 75 megabytes of consumption, and that one led to a decrease in uninstalls and an increase in MAU. So we had very, very clear causal data. Causal versus correlational. Correlational is you look at two things and you can see a relationship, but you don't know whether A affected B. Causal is you did this and then this causes this. Right? So we had causal data, and our team basically said, let's act on this. Let's try to remove or reduce the disk usage. And we started with, let's try to increase MAU because that's the eventual business goal. So the business metric or the business goal here is retaining people. And so MAU is the measure of that. The second thing we did is we started running local experiments. So we're looking at what is the app using on my phone and what random files do we have and are they all useful? And so we started with that approach and we started fixing we found things. We found weird things. We started fixing those things. There were 3 of us on this project. And for about a month and a half, we kind of did this in a sort of random manner and nothing really moved. And it helped at this point that I had a mentor who was very, very good at data. And I think a lot of what I've learned from him, Daniel. And he ended up kind of pushing hard on like, where's the data? Like how do you know that these random experiments you're doing are actually what's going to affect users? Also, one really important insight was it doesn't make sense if you reduce space or for someone who's got a 128 gig phone and lots of free space. It doesn't change their usage. Someone who has a 16 gig phone or an 8 gig phone and has only like 200 megabytes of free space, if you shave usage for them, that's really, really impactful. So I would say the first insight was focusing on the right cohort of people that would benefit. And why that's important is the kind of experiments that you're going to run, you know who you're running them for. People that have 128 gig phones probably had 2 GB video caches. So if we started trying to trim video caches, we would possibly help them. But what we really had to do was look at this cohort. The second thing we learned was local debugging was not useful. And we actually added logging for directory level usage. And now we could show that and it's obviously sampled, so only a percentage of people, we're only pulling data for a small percentage of users, but we could understand which directories are using space. And from that, we identified about 20 things that were worth fixing. I would say the third really good insight or third good thing we did there was we said, let's not focus on MAU as a metric because MAU is a lagging metric and you can't run an experiment and see MAU change, monthly active users. So we just picked megabytes as a metric. And we said that if we can reduce a certain number of megabytes, we know that from our past experiment, 75 megabytes meant X million users per month. So we just use that as a proxy. And the rest of the project was focused on megabytes. We would measure MAU at the end, but we weren't measuring MAU on a day-to-day or experiment by experiment basis. We picked the 4 big bets, and I guess that's a fourth insight. Like we didn't take all 20 things. We really focused on a few high priority items, and then we went all in. And I think this is another thing I want to stress on. Sometimes when you have lots of cool ideas, you don't have a thesis of why this idea is better than the other, and you'll kind of dilute your time. Let's do a little bit of this. Oh, this is not working. Okay, let me do this. If you have one idea that you know if you get this done, it will deliver a whole ton of impact, you can be much more motivated. And that's kind of what we did. We picked 4 big bets. Over the next 3 months, 3 or 4 months, we ended up working on them. We had a goal. I think we wanted to reduce 75 megabytes. I think we ended up reducing 100 megabytes for that cohort of users. We also, since we used to run holdouts, so like it's like a long-term experiment, we could measure that we actually increased MAU, and I don't remember the numbers, but I think it was in the order of 1 million people. So, and again, I pulled this up yesterday. The ARPU for Facebook, the average revenue per user is about $10 to $50. So if we actually retained 1 million people, we saved Facebook $10 to $50 million from that experiment, from that project. So yeah, clear. So we had really good insights on starting the project. We picked a clear metric. We focused on the big bets, and we went all in, and we kept measuring. And this project took 6 months, but it was so successful, and we found a bunch of other things to do that we continued doing this effort for another additional 12 months. So, so yeah, that was an example where, as you asked me, it really worked, and I learned. I learned how to do things. So
yeah, and that sounds like even though when you started, there was like a particular goal in mind, or there was an objective in mind at that point of time. There was clarity, and you had data, past data to actually rely on as well. But it almost seems like that because of measurement, you were able to evolve your, kind of objective as you were going.
yeah.
And at the same time, the business impact and the overall impact that you were able to create was a lot more than what you started from the beginning, because you were constantly evaluating if you're headed in the right direction or not.
Yeah. And I think coming back to, like, you can have a thesis in the beginning. So in this case, we did have a very clear thesis why it's worth doing it. But it is the experimentation in the first almost 1.5 months. That was part of the project. It wasn't a planning phase. We had started the project and we were learning, and then we kind of shifted focus a little bit, and the focus became much tighter after that. So
Right. All right. So I think this was a good example of what business value could you deliver through this process. And I think it almost seems like this is something that you can totally justify spending 1 month, 1.5 months on, because of what you were able to achieve in the end. Uh, would you also have examples of where, because I think as I'm thinking about it, it seems like you might not always have this kind of clarity on what you want, like why are you picking a project? And these might be projects where the statement itself is slightly vague, right? And you're trying to clarify that statement. And in that process, is it possible that what you started with and what you ended up doing was not entirely different, but quite different? Like, have you had experiences like that also while prioritization?
yeah, I think it happens a lot. And I think the crux is you start with some thesis or some reason why you're doing this. And as you start doing it, and as you're measuring, you learn things, and then you realize that maybe this isn't the right thing to look for, but you find something else in that area. One example at PhonePe is that we are trying to reduce calls to the server, and PhonePe has 200 million monthly active users, and we basically have a billion. Like, the app does billions of calls every day. And initially, we started the project thinking that let's do this. It'll make the app performance better because the app is chatty. And then as we started looking at the data, we ended up so the engineer got good data, again, spent a month, categorized calls going to multiple services. And at some point we realized that maybe we should just start by reducing load on the servers. And there were some calls that just seemed unnecessary. So the shift was not necessarily for app performance, but we moved the shift, we shifted the focus to server load, and we just started looking at numbers, and we started making fixes and reducing load on the server and observing the effect. And actually now we've been doing this for about 5 or 6 months. I think we are probably going to reduce overall load on our servers by 10%. Now we're going through a process of understanding, by doing this, what is the cost saving? And should we continue trying to reduce server load, or are there other, because now we've done these fixes, we can understand, is that server load the biggest problem we're trying to solve? And for example, there is actually now a new problem that's peak load. So like at the time that our servers at the peak load, that is perhaps the time that we have to look at the load and just reduce that. That would be more impactful than trying to broadly reduce load over the whole day. And we're also coming back to like, should we actually look at the performance impact, like the client performance impact, like the app move faster, is the app less chatty? And so now we're at a point where we're evaluating impact, and probably for the next 6 months, we may take a slightly different decision. So, but we couldn't have done this. If we had started upfront, we would have spent too much time in analysis. And I think having done this puts us in a place where we have really good data to make the next sort of, I guess, problem or priority.
Right. So if you have to kind of talk a little bit, and I think both of these examples of Facebook and PhonePe are, I think, really, really useful in understanding how the whole process of prioritization through impact could work and could look like. I think I have, of course, like questions around the culture bit as well. Like, how were you able to build that mindset, say, from Facebook to your team at PhonePe to some degree? But before we get into that, I also want to ask, beyond some of the things that you have shared, what are the other like really good benefits of doing something like this? Like, so I think some
Yeah.
of the things that we spoke about earlier, other than that, are there like some big pieces which you feel often go
Yeah.
ignored, or we tend to ignore them?
Yeah. And just for time check, I think we're past like
Yeah,
the
we are
midpoint.
at
So
40.
so I'll answer this, and then maybe we can take questions. And then if we have a gap in questions, I can answer more questions on culture and benefits.
Right, right.
But
Yeah.
just coming back to benefits, like I think having a very clear definition of, or articulation of why we're doing the project is really helpful. Because I mean, even if you take the server project example, there will be times when you have to make a decision. Should I do this fix or that fix? And if you know that you're doing it for server load versus app experience, you might make a different decision. So knowing what you're looking for helps decision making. In fact, I use the word, it democratizes decision making, because then you don't have to like go check with a PM or with a manager or a tech lead, but like every engineer can start making the right decision or propose a good decision. I alluded to this earlier, but if you have a very, very clear picture of impact, it motivates the team, right? So if I just throw these numbers at you and say that we have billions of calls and we can possibly save 10% of those calls, and those 10% of calls, if we save those, we'll probably save the company millions of dollars. As an engineer, you're much more motivated than, I think so and so service is chatty and this service is bad, and I think this piece of code is bad. Let's fix this, right? The first one gives you, I mean, the second one is not bad, but the first one gives you much, much more motivation. And I think it just gives the whole team a better definition of what the outcome is. The way we would do it is we would want to write it down somewhere so that people that join the project later, or people that may not have been part of the initial thought process, they can still see the thought process and what's written. So it gives visibility into why we're doing things to the whole team. Sometimes when it's decided in a meeting and it's fuzzy, new people coming in don't understand, and they'll just do what they're told. So
Got it. So I think it's decision making, then it's adding nuance to your impact or the outcome. And the third is basically getting that kind of alignment from your team and from the folks which may not technically understand what you're talking about in a lot of
Yeah.
cases. That's
Yeah.
great. So I think we'll take like a little bit of a pause here and see if there are questions from the audience. I see that there is one in the chat which says, "How would you prioritize and measure projects that are innovative in nature?" Interesting. Where you doing really have too much. Basically, where you don't have a lot of upfront data is what they're talking about. So where you're experimenting, I'm assuming that's what they're talking about, or it
Yeah.
might be something which is new and innovative.
Yeah. No, I like that question because look, a lot of these things are sort of so like the disk footprint example, we had a very clear understanding of what the impact would be, but sometimes like the Hindi keyboard one, we didn't, right? Like we had some proxy data, directional data. And so if you're doing something new and innovative, right? Um, Actually, let me flip it over and talk about
Yeah.
some of the questions that I ask at the end,
Yeah.
and then I'll talk about how those questions will put you in the right direction. So I generally ask a few questions like, what problem are you solving, or what opportunity are you looking at? How big is it? How bad is it? Provide some metrics. Um, what's the expected impact? How will you measure it? So now, if you take the like you have this innovative project, think about how you will measure success. So, and I don't know, are we taking questions live? Can we have a conversation, or is this just,
Uh, Pramod,
I don't,
somebody from Hasgeek, can you clarify that? Is it possible?
Yeah. Sure. So Mrudula, if you're on the call, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask the question that you have.
and if you're not comfortable, okay, if you are comfortable asking,
Hey,
awesome.
hello,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
she's.
Yes.
No, I'm fine asking. I just had because I was thinking of cases like let's say you're like now we're thinking of AI, and also I was also
Hey,
thinking of
sorry, Mridula, your voice is breaking. I think
like
your
when the
net.
iPhone in instance. I mean those were cases where you don't have a precedent. Can you hear me better now?
We
Yeah.
we
But I
lost a
think
lot of
Gaurav,
words in the middle.
I
the
was
middle.
basically I was thinking of cases like now with AI we have so many use cases which previously have not been solved. Or even when I was thinking of like when the iPhone initially came into existence, we didn't really I mean there was no precedent for that kind of interface. So I mean those kind of cases where you don't have a precedent, where you don't have data on which you can base your data prioritization on, then how would you go about prioritizing?
Yeah. So, um, let's take. So again, I think AI is interesting because if you're talking about how would you even think of building something like that, um, I think that's a so there's AI as such, and then there's use cases around AI. I think the use cases around AI is still easier to quantify, but the iPhone example is actually a very good one. So they did have a size of the market. They did have existing smartphones that were crappy. I actually have a blog post from like 15 years ago when I first used the iPhone, and I talked about how I thought the iPhone is a game changer. And I think that they saw the market, they saw problems in the market, and they had the ability to build a better solution. They knew how to build good hardware, they knew how to build really good OSs, and I'm sure it's not. I don't think it's Steve Jobs saying, "I feel like this will be good." I'm sure there was measurements of here's the total market size, here's the problem with the current solutions, here's why this solution is better. And they probably even did they must have done some sort of research on like what will people pay for a better experience. And with that, you can put some numbers and think about the total market. And if it is a big enough market, it's worth, I mean, obviously in this case, they probably spent a ton of money building it out, but they knew that there was a big enough market. Um, they didn't know what the iPhone was going to look like 10 years later, In fact, the first version of the iPhone did not have an app. It didn't have an app store. It was just a nice. Actually, interesting you bring it up. This is the second iPhone.
Oh
I
no,
used to have
you
the first.
don't. You really have that?
I have this, and this is what Pixel, um, my Pixel 8 looks like, and this is what the second iPhone looks like.
Hey, I'm back to
So
basics. So mine is like a mini version of the old one.
yeah.
No, but
So
I think Ridla, that's an interesting question because you're also talking about uh does so I think I quickly want to check with Mridula first. Like, is that closer to the question that you asked, like what Gaurav is talking about? Does
Yeah,
that
yeah,
answer your
pretty much.
question to some extent? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
pretty much.
Gaurav, anything that you would like to add here?
yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is there is some sort of impact. In this case, it must have been market sizing. So there is something you can try to estimate, and then over time you can start refining your hypotheses, right? So maybe their hypothesis was people will want a phone with better UI, and then they start building it out, and then they do some research or they do some prototyping, and then they start identifying pieces that um, where the hypothesis is correct, and then places where the hypothesis is wrong, then they can throw that away and go in a different direction. So yeah. And by the way, just one more thing on innovative or risky projects is that even in our planning, we have some risky, what I call risky projects, where it's not clear that they will actually succeed. Um, but I want people to call it out. I want people to say, this is a risky project. We have a 50% chance of succeeding because we don't know if this is actually going to work out. Um, and we may still prioritize that. So just to put this in very simple math, if I have two projects that will both deliver X impact, and one project is 100% guaranteed to happen, and this is 50% guaranteed to happen, I'm going to pick the 100% project. If I have two projects, this is going to deliver X impact, guaranteed. This is going to deliver 5X impact, but it's risky. Then it's a decision. Should I take the risky project? And is it worth it? Does it fit in with my team's goals, charter? Do we have room for that risk? We might pick the 5X project knowing that it's risky. If there's a project that's 10% likely to succeed, but 100X, impact, we might even do that. And that's actually what VCs do all the time, right? They're investing in 100X projects, which have a less than 10% chance of succeeding. So there is room for risk. There is room for innovation. It's just good to call it out. And over time, as you're testing it out, you will start de-risking the project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that was a good point to talk about, how do you calculate risk and how do you make decisions around that? Okay, any other questions? Pramod, I'm not able to see the YouTube feed, anything from there.
No, currently we don't have any other questions.
Okay.
But if
Okay.
I can maybe jump in with a
Yes.
question of my own since I was listening
Yes,
in.
please do.
So Gaurav, maybe one thing people would be curious to know is how does this kind of thinking fit in with typically, quarterly plans or, like OKRs that companies have?
Yeah. It fits in. I think it fits in really well, actually. It can fit in. So like we do half yearly planning now at PhonePe. And actually, in fact, we're doing roadmap planning in a couple of weeks. And so we've already talked about each track or each sub team is going to go and think of some problems or opportunities in their space. And they have a couple of weeks to go pull some data, do some analysis. And just to give you a very concrete picture of how we're doing this, the second and third week of December, the leads and the teams are going to propose a few things. They're going to pull data. And at the end of that, we'll do a short prioritization and we might pick a few things and we might push back and say, hey, this project you have, the data you have is not clear enough yet. And then they have a little bit more time in the first 2 weeks of January. And by Jan 15th, we will publish a roadmap. And so we do have this baked into our process, but it needs lead time. Like I can't go to people today and say, give me a roadmap for the next 6 months, and you have 4 days to do it. Because
Right.
then they don't really have time to assess. Some of these tracks people have been working on, and they already have data, they already have insights. So in that case, it's more iterative. But also this process allows people to step back and think again, like within this domain, what are things they could think about from scratch. And that's where I think it's really helpful. They have the 2 to 4 weeks to think about it and pull some data. So,
Great. Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
yeah, I can talk a bit about OKRs also if you're interested, but should
Yeah, go
I?
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So OKRs are interesting. I feel like it's a topic. It's one of those topics that gets covered a lot. Like it's one of those school terms. And I actually talked to a friend of mine. She's an SVP at Google last week, and I was asking her about OKRs and understanding how it works. And look, they are. So I haven't worked in a place that does OKRs, but I've worked in places that do goals and prioritization. And so OKRs, I think in my mind, are just a more structured form of doing this, where you do it org wide. Typically, it's done org wide. And so I think her example is that YouTube, for example, does it much more meticulously than, let's say, Android in within Google. And there are eventually there's some org wide pillars, and that if you look at the top, they're probably looking at anywhere from 10 to 20 OKRs. And then these sort of flow down, and each team will have some OKRs that should contribute to the top OKRs. So it's conceptually, it's more of a process, and everything I've talked about doesn't have to be done in this OKR kind of process. You don't need the whole company or the whole org to align. You can do this in a team. You can do this in 10 people. You can do this in 3 people. So I would say that's the slight difference between this and OKRs as a process. But the goals of both are the same. Like, what is your objective? Like, what is the outcome, or what is your goal of doing this? And then how are you going to measure it? And that's the key result, the KR part. And so conceptually, it's kind of doing the same thing.
Right. I think that's a great point. It's kind of doing it on an ongoing basis rather than just do it once or twice a year and then forget about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I also have another question because you were talking. I think a lot of what we've spoken about is from the perspective of how engineers and, say, engineering teams can do a lot of this. Is there a role here that, say, PMs or other teams cross-functionally have a role to play in prioritization for impact? Like, what does that look like a little bit?
Yeah. Great question. So I may have kept saying engineers, and I apologize. I think this applies to anyone, any stakeholder. In fact, typically in a product team, it is usually the PM who is doing this. The PM is often defining why they're building something and should list the impact. So I don't think it's tied to specific roles. I think as a culture, people should get into the habit of doing this. If the PM has a very good articulation of impact, awesome. If they don't, then engineers should be able to ask, like, why are we doing this? What's the potential impact? And in some teams or in some cases, maybe the PM doesn't define it that way, and then engineers should define it themselves. So it's not tied to a role, even though PMs sort of by definition are expected to do more of this.
Right.
In
We
fact,
also have
actually,
another question. Yeah, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, in fact, I want to encourage engineers to not think this is only a PM problem. Only the PM should think about impact. And if the PM or even a manager gives me this, like at Facebook, as an engineer, you could push back even up to your director or VP. And if you could kind of say, I don't understand the impact of this project. Why are you asking me to do this? I'm not going to work on this until you tell me why it's impactful. So that culture, I think, is kind of what I'm getting at. It's not,
Yeah, and
you
I
should be
think
able to.
it brings us back to the fact that it's taking away subjectivity and feelings from a
Yeah.
project, right? Like something that might be close to an individual is not a good
Yeah.
reason to pick that project.
Yeah.
And here you're saying that whether it's an engineer or a PM, everybody needs to bring data. So I think
Yeah.
it's like
I
a
think
data-driven. prioritization.
Yeah. I think we have one question, and it's from
Yeah.
someone who I'm interested in hearing the question from. So
Yeah, sure. Hey Gaurav, I wanted to know, when there is a trade-off that has to be taken between prioritizing a critical tech debt, where we could see impact from the user experience point of view, but still there is a competing times critical business requirement coming. So how would you push back, and what framework do you use?
first of all, Anant and I work together, and I swear this is not a planted question. Secondly, I wanted to remark, when does this ever happen that business use cases get pushed over tech debt? I mean, I'm being silly. So yeah, that's a good one. I think that happens a lot. And I think the answer there is, I think what I've seen is that when people want to solve tech debt, they often don't articulate impact well enough. Business use cases typically will have impact articulated. And with tech debt, it's sometimes like this piece of code is bad, or this piece of code is whatever. Like, we don't have unit tests for this. The impact there is not very clear to someone, like, to, let's say, a business owner, right? And I think being able to articulate that we had 8 bugs last quarter in this piece of code, and each bug delayed the release or delayed this feature by 2 days. And we know that this piece of code is bad, and so we lost 16 days of productive time. If we improve this piece of code and we spend the next 10 days improving this piece of code, we can hopefully save a similar 18 days this quarter. So being able to articulate why fixing the tech debt will eventually lead to business outcomes. And they don't always have to be business outcomes. Sometimes they can be a purely engineering out. Like, if engineers are not able to understand this code base, that is not directly like, it's harder to show that as a business outcome. But I think with tech debt, the feedback I have is just explain why. Like, why are you doing this? What's going to get better with this? And sometimes it's fuzzy, like you can't really explain in numbers, but just saying we need to do this, we need to fix this code, like, that's not helpful. Sometimes comparisons are helpful, like saying we have 5% unit test coverage and all of the other teams have 30% unit test coverage. Like, that sometimes can just be a justification. So yeah, I think that my general advice for tech debt is better articulation and balance the portfolio. Your team cannot be doing 100% tech debt in this quarter. It's very reasonable to do 20% tech debt, maybe even 40% tech debt, depending on the kind of product. So just balancing how much new feature business type stuff you're doing versus tech debt. Does that help, Anand?
Yeah, that helps. Like, I think being able to say, maybe this sprint, maybe I would try to take heavy on product requirement, and getting that buy-in for the next sprint has worked in the past for me. But yeah, I agree on.
Yeah. I think also bounding it. That's one last thing. Bounding the tech debt effort. Sometimes tech debt efforts start and then they take way longer. If you can bound it, it will just give whatever your business leaders or your engineering leaders a little bit more confidence versus an open-ended effort. So.
Thanks.
Yeah, I also feel like here it's important I think we often feel that we're not able to convince other people because they are not motivated to get convinced. But I think in reality, it's more like the other way around, where they don't understand what will you achieve in the end, and they don't understand how it's going to help the larger company, and hence it becomes harder and harder for you to sell on tech debt. And I think this idea about kind of also figuring out why you are doing something will help you get that clarity. Am I picking this only because it looks good, or there's like a more deeper reason for it? And I think this is something like one of my biggest takeaways from this talk as well. And while we're talking about takeaways, Gaurav, is there anything that, and we are at 10 PM mark. So
Okay.
we're right on time at this point. So anything that you would like to say in terms of summarizing and just generally, sharing your broader experience with this group?
I think again, make sure you keep the time for this and make this part of your process and even part of your culture if you can. And I know we didn't talk about that, but I'm just going to give that as a make it part of your culture. And I think the second thing is that there is always a way to find directional data. It could even be a survey, like it doesn't have to be super precise, but start leaning on that. And I think one thing I'm actually happy to offer, like if people have projects where they can't explain the data up front, like I'm even happy to brainstorm with you and kind of tell you this is the sort of data you could look for. So Mridula, if you have innovative projects that you want to find data, or you're trying to question what data should you find, like I'm actually happy to brainstorm. So yeah, figure out how to get that data and then add measurement. So I think those are my three takeaways, but maybe I'll hand it to Pramod, who's like you and I've been talking for the last hour. Pramod may have a more outside view on what we should look for or his takeaways.
Uh, no, thanks, Gaurav. No, that was fantastic. I think you did a good summary, and thanks so much, Gaurav, for actually taking the time and conveying all this information, and to Sanchita for moderating it so well. Thanks to everyone who joined in today. And I think here I should also call out that we have the next talk in the series coming up in on December 21st. That will be from Deepthi Agarwal, who is a director of engineering at Flipkart, and she'll be talking about somewhat related. So the talk is titled "When Quality Matters and When You Have to Transcend Resource Barriers in Software Delivery." So we'll hopefully that will take the conversation forward. And thanks to everyone who logged in and engaged with the talk today. And please, check out the video once it gets uploaded. Thanks so much, Gaurav and Sanchita. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanchita.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Pramod.
everyone.
Thank you, Gaurav. All right. Bye, folks. Have a great night for everyone in
Yeah.
India. Bye.
Bye.